There are horror films that unsettle you because of what they show, and then there are horror films that disturb you because of what was taken away. Between the final cut and the version that reaches theaters, a quiet transformation can occur. Not a scandal, not a ban. Just decisions made behind closed doors, scenes shortened, moments reordered, silences erased. By the time the film is released, something essential has shifted, even if most viewers can't immediately name what's missing. This isn't a story about extended editions or alternate cuts released years later. It's about films whose original forms were never allowed to exist publicly. In these cases, the danger didn't lie in the monsters or the supernatural themes. It lay in tone, in patience, in endings that refused to reassure. Studios intervened not to save the films, but to reshape them, smoothing rough edges, clarifying ambiguity, replacing unease with something safer. And when those films premiered, some directors realized they were watching strangers. A few openly rejected the finished product, others removed their names or simply stopped speaking about the film altogether. What remained were movies that looked intact but felt hollow. Each of them carried two identities, the film that was conceived and the film that was permitted. Tonight, we're not revisiting debates about which version works better, we're looking at something more unsettling. What happens when a horror film's true shape is erased and the version that survives is only a shadow of what was intended? These are 15 horror films that were recut so severely, even their own creators refused to stand by them. Fact 1. Hellraiser, Bloodline, 1996. Hellraiser, Bloodline, was conceived as a tragedy stretched across centuries. The original cut reportedly embraced its ambition, allowing past, present, and future to bleed together. The mythology was given space to unfold, treating horror as something inherited rather than escalated. The film wasn't meant to race forward, it was meant to accumulate weight. Studio intervention dismantled that structure. The film was heavily recut, with entire sequences removed and its narrative compressed to meet runtime and franchise expectations. The temporal sweep was reduced, character arcs were flattened. The ending was reshaped into something safer and more familiar. Director Kevin Yagher disowned the theatrical release entirely, choosing to be credited under a pseudonym. His original cut was never released, and its full scope remains unknown. What survives is a film constrained by what it was forced to become, haunted by a version that reached further, lingered longer, and was never allowed to exist. Fact 2. Don't Look Now, 1973. Don't Look Now was never designed to guide its audience gently. Nicholas Roeg's original assembly reportedly pushed even further into disorientation. Time fractured without warning. Emotional states overlapped. Meaning emerged through repetition and association rather than clarity. Grief and horror were inseparable, folding into one another until the viewer could no longer tell where one ended and the other began. Post-production pressure pushed against that chaos. Certain sequences were trimmed to reduce confusion, transitions were softened, the edits subtly imposed order where Roeg had intended freefall. The changes were not dramatic, but they were decisive. Roeg later implied that the final cut compromised the film's emotional rhythm, reducing its sense of vertigo. What remains is still deeply haunting, but more navigable than the version he envisioned. The earlier assembly, rumored to be harsher, colder, and more punishing, has never been released. The film endures as a masterpiece, shadowed by the suggestion that it once cut even deeper. Fact 3. The Wicker Man, 1973. Before it became a cult landmark, The Wicker Man existed as something far more fragile and deliberate. The earliest cut reportedly unfolded like a ritual rather than a narrative. Songs were allowed to run their full length. Scenes lingered without urgency. The island's customs were not framed as interruptions or curiosities, but as a complete, self-contained world that slowly absorbed the outsider at its center. Horror emerged through inevitability, not surprise. Distributors found this deeply unsettling, fearing audiences would reject its pace and opacity. The film was aggressively shortened. Musical sequences were trimmed or removed. Key transitions were reordered. The rhythm that bound the story together was broken, reshaping the film into something more conventional and less hypnotic. Director Robin Hardy later spoke openly about his dissatisfaction, explaining that the theatrical cut stripped away much of the film's ritualistic power. Although longer versions surfaced years later, the original intended structure was never fully restored. What Survives is a film that still casts a spell, but one whose deepest enchantment was interrupted before it could fully take hold. Fact 4. The Keep, 1983. The Keep was meant to feel timeless. Michael Mann's original cut reportedly prioritized atmosphere above all else. Long shadows, minimal exposition, and a sense of ancient menace were allowed to dominate. The story unfolded slowly, with meaning emerging through mood rather than clarity. Studio interference was devastating. Large portions of the film were removed during editing, including scenes essential to character and coherence. The score was altered, the pacing was aggressively tightened. What had been a slow descent into myth became abrupt and fragmented. Mann later publicly disowned the theatrical release, stating unequivocally that it was not his film. The original cut, rumored to be significantly longer and far more immersive, was never released and may no longer exist. What remains is a cinematic ruin, evocative, mysterious, and visibly incomplete, marked by the absence of what it was forced to lose. Fact 5. Exorcist II, The Heretic, 1977. From the start, Exorcist II, The Heretic was conceived as something hypnotic rather than confrontational. Director John Boorman's original assembly reportedly embraced repetition, abstraction, and dream logic. Possession was not treated as spectacle, but as an echo, something that lingered psychologically rather than erupting violently. The film was meant to feel unsettling in a quiet, almost meditative way. Audiences rejected it outright. Following disastrous test screenings, the film was dismantled in post-production. Scenes were removed, structure was rearranged, ambiguity was replaced with explanation. The tone was flattened into something more literal, stripping away the film's most unconventional qualities. Boorman later acknowledged that the released version bore little resemblance to his original intent. The earlier cut, described by those who saw it as strange, alien, and deeply unsettling, has never been released. What Survives is a fractured film, haunted by the knowledge that something far more daring was deemed unacceptable. Fact 6. Event Horizon, 1997. Long before Event Horizon became infamous for what it shows, it was designed to terrify through what it suggested. The earliest cut reportedly focused on disorientation rather than spectacle. Scenes were allowed to unfold without urgency, trapping the audience inside the same uncertainty as the crew. Violence existed, but it was secondary. The true horror came from implication, the sense that the ship had crossed a boundary that language could no longer describe, and that something irreversibly wrong had returned with it. That vision proved untenable. Post-production changes were drastic. Test screenings labeled the film confusing and relentlessly bleak. Entire sequences were removed, including footage that explored the ship's previous crew in far more disturbing detail. The edit clarified the narrative, tightened the pacing, and pushed the film toward visceral impact. Director Paul W. S. Anderson later admitted the theatrical version was a compromise. He has since stated that the darkest material was lost and likely destroyed, making restoration impossible. What remains is a film remembered for intensity, while a more unbearable version survives only through rumor and regret. Fact 7. The Fog, 1980. Before it was reshaped, The Fog relied on waiting. The earliest cut leaned heavily into atmosphere, empty streets, distant sounds, long stretches where nothing happened except the movement of mist. The threat wasn't a figure, it was the environment itself, creeping forward without urgency. Test screenings changed the course of the film. Audience reactions prompted significant re-editing. New scenes were added to sharpen impact. Shock moments were introduced. The pacing was tightened to deliver clearer peaks, reducing the film's reliance on suggestion. John Carpenter has openly acknowledged these changes, noting that the released version was a response to audience expectations. While he later accepted the final cut, he has also implied that something quieter was lost in the process. What's rarely discussed is how different the film might feel without those interventions if the fog had been allowed to arrive slowly, without warning, and without explanation. Fact 8. Burnt Offerings, 1976. Burnt Offerings was originally shaped as a study in erosion. The early cut reportedly lingered on domestic decay, small behavioral changes, emotional withdrawal, the slow transformation of a family under unseen pressure. The house wasn't meant to attack, it was meant to consume, gradually and without spectacle. That approach was softened in the edit. Concerns about repetition and pacing led to trims that reduced the film's slow burn rhythm. Scenes designed to establish unease through routine were shortened. The influence of the house became more explicit, more readable, and less insidious. Director Dan Curtis later suggested that the theatrical cut lost some of its psychological density. What remained worked, but it explained too much, too soon. There are long-standing claims that an earlier version made the house feel less like a haunted location and more like a living exchange, something that took warmth in return for comfort. That cut has never surfaced, leaving only traces of what might have been. Fact 9. The Changeling, 1980. In its earliest form, The Changeling was structured around absence. The initial edit reportedly allowed grief to dominate the film's rhythm. Silence wasn't filler, it was the point. Scenes were permitted to linger well past comfort, forcing the audience to sit inside loss before the supernatural ever announced itself. The haunting was meant to feel patient, as though the house existed on its own timetable. That patience was questioned. During post-production, notes pushed the film toward momentum. Pauses were shortened. The supernatural thread was emphasized earlier and more clearly. The edit subtly redirected the experience away from mourning and toward a more traditional ghost narrative. Director Peter Medak later acknowledged that the final version moved faster than he had intended. The film remained effective, but some of its emotional weight was streamlined away. Those who worked on early assemblies have suggested that the original cut allowed sorrow to suffocate the story, making the haunting feel like an extension of grief rather than a separate threat. That version has never been screened publicly, leaving behind a film whose most unsettling power may have been quiet. Fact 10. The Sentinel, 1977. At its core, the Sentinel was intended to watch rather than attack. The earliest cut reportedly treated its setting with reverence and restraint. The building wasn't meant to startle, it was meant to observe. Scenes lingered, silence mattered. The horror emerged slowly, as if the space itself had been waiting for the right moment to reveal what it guarded. That patience became a liability. Post-production adjustments pushed the film toward immediacy. Shocking imagery was brought forward, subtle connective scenes were reduced, the rhythm shifted from quiet surveillance to abrupt intrusion, trading sustained unease for sharper impact. Director Michael Winner later voiced dissatisfaction with the final cut, suggesting that the balance between atmosphere and spectacle had been lost. The film remained powerful but fragmented. Those close to the production have claimed that earlier versions felt far more suffocating, less eager to explain themselves. That cut has never been released, leaving the Sentinel suspended between the film it became and the one it was never allowed to remain. Fact 11. The Possessed, 1977. The Possessed did not begin as a film about spectacle. Its original construction reportedly emphasized psychological erosion rather than overt possession. Faith, identity, and perception were meant to collapse gradually, leaving the audience uncertain whether anything supernatural was occurring at all. The horror lived in doubt, in the fear that the mind itself was failing. That uncertainty didn't survive the edit. Post-production changes pushed the film toward definition. Ambiguous moments were clarified, explanations were inserted, the pacing shifted to highlight visible disturbances instead of internal collapse. What had once been a slow unraveling became something more recognizable and far less unsettling. The director later rejected the theatrical version outright, stating that it no longer represented the film he made. The released cut, he argued, replaced internal terror with surface-level shock. Rumors continued to circulate about a darker, more restrained assembly that allowed uncertainty to dominate. Whether it was dismantled or simply forgotten remains unclear. What survives is a film marked by absence, as if its most essential ideas were removed and never restored. Fact 12. The Incubus, 1982. From the beginning, the Incubus was conceived as something corrosive rather than confrontational. Early assemblies reportedly allowed discomfort to spread slowly, almost invisibly. The story unfolded through implication, unsettling glances, fractured conversations, and the sense that moral decay had already taken hold long before anything supernatural was acknowledged. The film wasn't meant to explain its evil, it was meant to let it linger. That approach raised alarms. During post-production, the edit began to favor clarity over unease. Scenes considered too abstract were shortened, transitions were tightened. Moments that relied on silence and suggestion were reduced to keep the narrative moving. The film was reshaped into something more literal, more easily categorized. Director John Hoff later distanced himself from the released version, noting that its atmosphere had been compromised. What remained still hinted at something darker underneath, but it no longer trusted ambiguity to do the work. There are persistent accounts of an earlier cut that leaned far more heavily into moral corruption, where the Incubus felt less like a threat to defeat and more like a presence that could never truly be removed. If that version exists, it has never been shown. Fact 13. The Curse 1987. From the outset, the curse was designed to feel contaminated. Early cuts reportedly leaned into a slow, relentless decay of land, of family, of sanity. Inspired by Lovecraftian themes, the film treated horror as an invasive force that could not be confronted or understood, only endured. The pacing was deliberate, the atmosphere oppressive. That vision was deemed impractical. Post-production shifted the emphasis toward immediacy. The edit accelerated the film's rhythm, foregrounding visible transformation and explicit effects. Subtle dread was replaced with clearer horror beats. The creeping sense of inevitability was broken into sharper moments of shock. Director David Keith later expressed dissatisfaction with the final version, suggesting it no longer captured the existential weight he had intended. The film that reached audiences felt more familiar and less disturbing. Those involved have claimed that earlier versions were far bleaker, allowing corruption to unfold without relief. If such cuts survive, they remain hidden, leaving the curse suspended between its original ambition and its altered form. Fact 14. The Awakening. 1980. The Awakening was never meant to announce its horror. In its original form, the film reportedly embraced distance and restraint. The supernatural elements were intended to remain remote, almost scholarly, allowing the audience to sense something ancient, stirring long before it was ever revealed. The fear lived in suggestion, in the feeling that history itself was resurfacing. That subtlety did not survive post-production. Studio intervention reshaped the film's structure, pushing it toward clarity and pace. Scenes that existed solely to cultivate unease were trimmed back. The narrative was streamlined. The ending was adjusted to feel more definitive, reducing the lingering ambiguity that had defined the original concept. Director Mike Newell later acknowledged that the theatrical cut diverged sharply from his intentions. The film that emerged was coherent and accessible, but far less haunting. What remains is a version that gestures towards something deeper, as if the true horror lies just beneath the surface, permanently out of reach. Fact 15. Ghost Story. 1981. When Ghost Story finally reached audiences, it carried the unmistakable feeling of a film that had already been altered by time before time itself could do the work. The earliest version was reportedly far more restrained. It trusted stillness, memory, and implication, allowing guilt and repression to hover over its characters without urgency. The horror was meant to unfold slowly, embedded in conversations that lingered too long and silences that refused to resolve. Fear wasn't meant to arrive, it was meant to accumulate. That approach unsettled the studio. Concerns surfaced that the film moved too deliberately, that its atmosphere outweighed its momentum. In response, the edit began to compress. Scenes built purely on unease were shortened or removed. Explanations were nudged forward, the rhythm tightened, and the suffocating weight of the story began to lift. Director John Irvin later suggested that the released version no longer reflected what he had set out to create. The finished film remained elegant and controlled, but the slow-burning dread had been interrupted. There are long-standing whispers of an earlier assembly that leaned harder into mood and moral decay, one that treated the story less as a ghost tale and more as a reckoning. If that version still exists, it has never been seen. Bonus: The Exorcist III, 1990. This was never meant to be a film about possession. In its original form, The Exorcist III treated evil as an argument, patient, articulate, impossible to silence. The horror lived in conversation, in stillness, in the terrifying possibility that belief itself could fracture under scrutiny. The studio didn't trust that silence. The film was reshaped, louder, clearer, safer. Blatty disowned the final cut, and the film was left divided between what it became and what it was never allowed to be. Which version do you think is more dangerous? The one filled with demons, or the one that leaves faith with no answers at all?